Welcome back to the DemystifySci podcast. I'm Anastasia,
I'm Shiloh.
and this is the place where we search for the theories and ideas that are going to change the world. One of the topics that we really love to explore is evolution. In general, people think that evolution is a solved problem, much like they think that physics is a solved problem, or economics is a solved problem, or archaeology is a solved problem. But the reality of the situation is that there are a lot of things that Darwin's theory of natural selection cannot possibly answer. And so today, for a conversation about the pieces that are missing from our understanding of evolutionary theory and the appearances of organisms on Earth, we have author, physiologist, and termite researcher, Professor J. Scott Turner, who was on the podcast for the first time 2 years ago when we really started thinking about these issues with the theory of evolution, because I think one of our patrons, Thomas Burwell, recommended him to us, because Turner had just written a book about the role of purpose, desire, and will in evolution. And these are things that you are not really allowed to talk about when you talk about biological processes, because we are in a deeply, deeply material paradigm when it comes to biology right now, which is that everything about biology has to be explained simply by the action of genes and genes alone. The behavior of the organism, the desires of the organism, the aims of the organism, the culture of the organism, none of this is allowed to be folded into evolutionary theory. And Turner just completed a little documentary for the National Association of Scholars about the 100-year anniversary of the Scripps monkey trial. And he reached out to us because he'd been thinking a lot about the way that evolution works in the popular culture. And so our conversation with him is broken up into two parts. The first part is the one where we deal with the conventional history of evolution. How did we come to see evolution as being this purely materialist force? How did the history of its relation to religious thought inform the way that we see it today? And the second half of the conversation, which we'll release in the coming weeks, is all about what it would look like to update evolutionary theory to actually reflect these weird and strange things that seem to be particular to life that do not appear in physics and chemistry.
Spoiler alerts, we probably have to redefine life more appropriately in the process of accomplishing this re-examination of evolution itself.
Yeah, exactly, because we right now have biology as being distinct from physics and chemistry. But the way that we treat biology is that it is nothing more than physics or chemistry. And so what are we doing here? How is it that we have a discipline that does not have some clear delineations inside of it that's separated from the purely materialist disciplines of physics and chemistry? And so we don't necessarily get to the bottom of it over the course of these two conversations, but in this first part, we really lay the groundwork of how it is that we came to see evolution in the way that we do today.
It turns out that Nasi and I know far less about the history of evolutionary biology than we ever thought that we did. So that was fun. It's actually quite a wild ride, and I love seeing all these people come up with their theories and the world they lived in, and that was really interesting.
Yeah, and then the way that these old ideas have been transformed through the lens of the new atheist movement, through the lens of materialism, into what somebody means when they say evolution today. And I just think that this is part of a larger conversation. We have a bunch of conversations lined up in the coming weeks that talk about these other pieces of what life is and how it works. And so this is a great opening salvo for that. And I think that you're really going to enjoy it.
Remember, guys, the podcast is entirely paid for by listeners like you. We can't do it without you, and we have no intention of selling things that we didn't make in order to pay for this space. That means you won't see Demystify Sci sponsored by Draft Chew Athletic Kings. But in order to make sure that we don't ever find ourselves sponsored by one of these heinous entities,
You will not find us hawking nicotine syringes anytime soon.
nicotine gambling packages, we're going to avoid that only by you coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci and pledging your support to the tune of whatever's in your pocket right now that you don't need. I mean, 75 cents a week is the smallest tier, and you probably have that sitting on your dresser over there right now.
No one has coins anymore, Shiloh.
Oh, I do. What about my precious coin collection?
We also have a business address where you can just mail us coins. Please do not mail pennies. Nobody wants pennies anyway.
Well, if 75 cents were debited from your digital account right now, you probably wouldn't notice. So maybe you can let 75 cents slip over to Demystify Sci every week. And through the power of large numbers, it can make sure that we have the power to go out, record more conversations on the road. We're about to gear up and go down to Southern California to record some. We've done a few live ones this year so far over the summer. I'm really stoked on being able to expand that ability to actually get together with people, because I think that's where we make the most headway. But it's expensive and we need your help. We also want to put on another conference. The last two were amazing. Those things aren't cheap either. We have big plans about how to be a more powerful exploratory organization, and we need your help. So come over and check it out. Patreon.com/DemystifySci.
Just to add to the idea about the conferences, one of the things that really gets my goat is that we can't offer super, super cheap conference tickets because there's just a ton of infrastructure that we have to pay for in order to actually throw it, which includes flying all the speakers out, hosting them, renting the place, feeding everybody that comes. If we could have some fund that comes from the Patreon that lets us make these conferences more affordable to a wider number of people, that would feel a lot better, because I don't want the space to be exclusive. I don't want to hide stuff behind a paywall. It's really, really important that the things that we do go out into the world and are freely accessible for as many people as humanly possible. And that is only possible if you support the project, because I vehemently am against the idea of turning this space into a billboard for corporate America. That is not what we do. That is not what we stand for. That is not what you, the listener, want. You don't want us breaking 5 times an episode to read you some fear-mongering advertisement about spring-loaded self-defense weapons or like hosiery. Like, come over to patreon.com, support the project. You will not regret putting your money into something that you believe in. I promise you that.
Maybe you like buying products, though. That's cool, because we actually make some products here with our own hands. One of them is a design, actually several designs, which we've put on different sportswear down in the shelf. Well, what would you call it?
We're selling hoodies. He makes it sound like we're selling like Slav track
Okay,
outfits.
well, it's t-shirts and sweatshirts, which you can wear for your favorite sporting event. All right, maybe if you're not into sporting athletic apparel, you love music, or you know somebody who does love music. And so we are very proud to be offering our latest album from our musical project, which is called Secretary of Nature. We have this printed on vinyl, which is a pretty awesome piece of material that expresses a very abstract concept, which is the music we create. You can test drive the merchandise before you buy it if you'd like. It is streaming over on Bandcamp, and it will be on Spotify any day now. And if you pick up this album, you'll guarantee that we have the means to make more albums. And in fact, we are hard at work on one of those, and I would love to be able to print it to vinyl as well. So pick up a copy of this, support the music project, support the podcast. And if you want to check it out before you buy it, we'll play you a little excerpt as we lead into this conversation with Scott Turner.
Which is that when you read papers about the origin of life, the way that people talk about Darwin is basically like a saint. I think I actually remember a paper about the like RNA world hypothesis for the emergence of the first organisms that literally called him the patron saint of biology.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, there's a lot of these strange things mixed up into it. But I wonder, is the current version of evolution that's popular more informed by somebody like Darwin, or has it been recodified by somebody like Richard Dawkins?
Before we get into the historic specifics of it, I want to make sure that I understand the overall point and what's happening here that we're going to be picking at today. Is it that people on both sides. Like, this is an interesting example of two fundamentalist groups that are talking past each other and missing the true natural history of living organisms.
So my frame is kind of that the history of our discussions about evolution can only be understood through kind of a psychological sociological lens, where evolution is always pitted against religious thinking, and religious thinking has a certain shape to it, and because of that kind of shape, it has forced our conversations about evolution into a very different kind of shape.
So they're like the negative image of religiosity or superstitious thinking or creationism or intelligent design or something like that.
Yeah, and something that you've mentioned many, many times before, which is that the way that we talk about evolution is that if we were to just replace the word evolution with God, the argument would not change, right? Because you're saying that, okay, well, evolution created these creatures to look this way. And you're like, but what does
Which
that mean? Like, have we actually explained anything? Have we gotten deep into the
and I
specifics?
understand at first you're like, shut up, like there's mechanism for evolution. But the way that some of the early Enlightenment and Renaissance thinkers might have phrased it would be, we can know the mind of God, right? And so
That's exactly
this
right.
word evolution just means knowing the mind of God in some sense, right? Because God's running these experiments trying to master his creation. But it is funny how if you just read the lines on a page and evolution did that and evolution did this and did that, I mean, you could easily be an archaeologist in the future and assume it was some deity or something like that.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's this is one reason why I wish that we taught undergraduates things like philosophy, for example, because our whole way of thinking about the history of life on Earth is wrapped up with our philosophical outlook. And one of the um, presumptions of the Darwinian idea is that this is a mechanism that doesn't require philosophy. Yet it actually is derived from a particular uh, philosophical stream in Western philosophical thought. You know, it's it it prides itself on being able to divorce itself from agency. That is from the agency that, say, a Platonist might attribute to the Platonic God, for example, or the agency that someone like Linnaeus, for example, who is a perfect example, Shiloh, of the person who basically substituted evolution for God. You know, the whole notion of Linnaeus's binomial nomenclature system was that you could actually map out the contours of the mind of God for the living world,
Hold on.
and so.
Who is this guy, Linnaeus? I know I should have learned this in high school, but maybe you
Oh,
can
sure.
put me
Okay.
at a
Yeah.
place in time where I can understand this guy a little bit
Yeah.
better.
Okay. So, when we describe a species with the so-called binomial, genus and species, and there's a whole a hierarchy of categories above that, that was the creation of Carolus Linnaeus, and that's the foundation of our entire system of biological taxonomy. That's the organization. And prior to Linnaeus,
When was this, by the way?
this was in the 17th century.
In
And
in Europe?
sorry, I should be filling in more.
Yeah,
Sorry about that.
I know
So,
nothing about this
yeah.
guy, so I'm
Oh,
really trying to get
okay.
a picture in my mind of
All right. So
where
Linnaeus,
the
yeah. So Linnaeus was a Swedish naturalist. He was part of the trend back then among naturalists to explore the world beyond Europe and beyond the country. Um, Prior to Linnaeus coming along, uh, naturalists or natural historians natural philosophers, there's a whole bunch of labels you could apply, would have their own system of classification. So you'd have plants that were useful for medicine and plants that weren't. You could have animals that lived in water versus animals that lived on land, those kinds of things. And what Linnaeus did was his real innovation was to gather around him a group of people, naturalists, who he actually called his apostles, of all things, and sent them around the world to try and find interesting plants and animals and things like that, and send them back to Sweden. And what Linnaeus did was he systematized all those different types of animals and plants into different species that could be grouped under different genera, and you have this whole hierarchy of classification there. And
Was it just based on the way they looked?
it was based on the way they looked, but it was also based on the way they reproduced. And so, for example, his botanic classification system was based upon the flowers. Yeah, that or the reproductive organs that different plants used, and of course, it was based upon similarities and things like this. And he defined the genus basically as different distinctive types of creatures. And so, you could have a genus for the roses, for example, and surrounding that or below that were a number of variants on the basic rose genus kind of idea. And Linnaeus thought that this is an organization of living nature that actually reflects the mind of God. He was a creationist. He thought this outlined a fundamental pattern of living,
Like kinship?
form and function, basic kinship.
Was he
Yes.
thinking of these as cousins on some linear track? Like, was he tracing this back to the creation? Like, was he thinking in the standard evolutionary terms that we learn in high school at that point?
Well, he wasn't really an evolutionist. This was a couple centuries before Darwin came along, and the motivation was actually to try to understand the different types of animals and plants and to look at the variations on that theme. And so the genus, for example, was kind of his idea of the ideal conception of a group of species that indicated what was in the mind of God. And at this time, the fashion in thinking was that you had this ideal world out there, and then you had the real world here, in which you would have a number of imperfect versions of that ideal. And so, one of the examples I use in my second book, Tinkerer's Accomplice, is that you had this Linnaean ideal of starfishness, a kind of essence of what it meant to be a starfish. And then all the real starfish that you saw, all the different species, were modifications on that basic ideal form, right? And so and so that's the basic outline of Linnaean taxonomy. Again, coming back to your point that there's this kind of quasi religious stream of thinking that permeates all through Darwinism, all through evolutionary thought, in fact. And uh, in part, it's hard for Darwinists because they do have this kind of certitude that they have the answers to how evolution works. It makes it very hard to penetrate their thinking.
Is the
Yeah.
quasi-religious thing that you're pointing to here just that there's an ideal form that needs to be discovered, or
One of the pretensions is that Darwinism uh, claims has a unique truth claim here, which is that we have the answer, and we have the answer without having to bring in all these kinds of messy things like philosophy, like religion, like those sorts of things. And that's That's the presumption that they hold to themselves. And it's a very dogmatic presumption. It's resistant to outside challenge from evidence from outside the particular body of evidence that is used to support this idea. And this does impart a kind of quasi-religious dogmatic aspect to a lot of modern evolutionary thought.
Well, it's really interesting because when we talk about evolution, yes, it's the theory of evolution, but people always ask what you don't believe in evolution, or they say, I believe in evolution. And it's a weird way to talk about a scientific idea. There's not I don't ever say that I believe in electricity. I believe in
Mhm.
Maxwell's laws. I believe in, I don't know, gravity. I remember actually in middle school there was a kid that wore a t-shirt that had like the gravity equations on it, and he was like, it's not just a good idea, it's the law.
Well, it's a phenomenon that's confused with a theory, or the theory is confused
Yeah.
with a phenomenon, right? It's like, is it apparent? Is that what you're referring to by evolution, or are you referring to the theory of evolution?
Yeah, so maybe we can go a little bit back
Yeah.
to Linnaeus, because this idea of the Platonic form with the fallen forms inhabiting the terrestrial realm that kind of are all variations
Mhm.
on some ideal theme, did he have a sense that that these forms were attempting to approach the ideal, or was it always the sense of some kind of corruptibility of regular matter that had produced these unideal starfish?
Yeah, I mean, inherent in all those realms of thought is that there's an element of striving of actual living things toward an ideal, and you can think about it, if you will, in terms of the soul. We're all imperfect reflections of what our souls are, and we always strive towards perfection. And that idea actually permeated a lot of natural history thought back in the time of Linnaeus, and actually up nearly until Darwin's thoughts on the issue in the 19th century. That there's this aspect of striving towards perfection that permeates the natural world, and this is the root of most of natural history that built up to Darwin's attempt to try to make sense of it. And one of the things that Darwin tried to do was to distance himself from this kind of idealism that was permeating natural history. I mean, that was part of his genius. And whether we have got there or not, I'm not entirely sure, but I think there's still a lot of vigorous debate about Darwinian thought, and this comes back to something that you mentioned, Anastasia, which is that y- you do have this dogmatic aspect of a lot of evolutionary thought. What you see right now in this is that you have the landscape of popular thought about evolution populating by these two basically warring sides that are not willing to give an inch to the other one, and so, for example, on the one side, you have this kind of dogmatic Darwinian approach to evolution, and on the other hand, you have either the religious fundamentalists on the extreme, or you have groups like the intelligent design theorists. You mentioned that, Shiloh, and they're basically two warring camps. They're both enveloped in these kind of ideological bubbles. And the sad thing about all this is that if you look at the broad scope of what's actually going on in the science of evolution and evolutionary thought, it's a very exciting place to inhabit, but the public really doesn't have a lot of access to that. There have been a number of of movements that have come up over the last couple of decades, for example, that are saying that, well, this idea of natural selection of favored genes, that's a very narrow way of thinking about how evolution works. That among other things, it doesn't account for the idea that life is actually kind of an intelligent phenomenon. That life is ingenious in many ways. Where does that ingenuity come from?
And how does
And
it
so,
play into the shapes that and forms that the creatures take and the niches they occupy and all of that? I want to go. I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, though, honestly, because
okay.
last person I heard in this story was Linnaeus, and I know Darwin's looming up ahead of Linnaeus. Did Darwin know? Was he working off of Linnaeus's taxonomy systems? And how much later was Darwin than Linnaeus, by the way?
So Darwin was mid-19th century. He
So like
he
200 years
graduated.
later?
What's that?
Was that like 200 years later or
Yeah,
something?
yeah. And of course, leading up to the beginning of the 19th century, there was this very rich tradition of natural history and a lot of this came from groups that have been informally called the parson naturalists. And so you have an Anglican clergyman who's out there in some country parish, and one of the things he does in between Sundays is he goes out and he studies nature and he describes, the plants that he sees, the relationships, and things like this. And of course, this was all motivated by the notion that you could read the mind of God in his works, in nature, and living nature around him. And so out of that came a kind of a comprehensive outlook on nature. It was promulgated by several peoples, including John Ray, but most notably William Paley, who kind of summarized a body of thought that was called natural theology, and basically it was that you can look at the mind of God by looking at his works, in nature. And at Cambridge, which is where Darwin attended, actually initially with the intent to become a parson naturalist himself, he was very immersed in William Paley's thought. Um, and of course, by this time, the systematic notion of classification of animals and plants, which of course was very much motivated by this, looking at the mind of God through his works, that kind of thing. Um, he was very immersed in that, and and it was very influential to him. But at the same time, at Cambridge, he was, getting involved with several geologists. For example, William Lyell was a geologist who promulgated this idea that there was no end or beginning to the earth, that you could explain all the landforms by looking at slowly operating actions like erosion, building up of mountaintops. And when Darwin was asked to join the crew of the Beagle on their worldwide, circumnavigation of the world, he took with him this kind of unsettled mix of natural theology and then the gradualist change idea that he was getting from Lyell, Charles Lyell. I should correct myself. And what he was able to see on his voyage, of course, and this is fairly well known, lots of documentaries and writings on this, was that he kept seeing things that didn't quite make sense, and he outlines a lot of the things that didn't make sense to him at the time. So, for example, why would the Galapagos finches look very much like finches over in Ecuador, but yet look so different among the different islands on the on the islands of the Galapagos. Where did that difference come from? Now, did it mean that you had separate areas of creation on each of the Galapagos Islands? And that, that just didn't seem very reasonable to him. And he also, because he was such a great naturalist, he had a keen eye for observation and systematizing information that he got from that, is that if you look at many examples of what goes on in nature, it doesn't say very many nice things about the mind of God. There's a lot of cruelty, a lot of death. The example that he used was the ichneumon wasp, who paralyzes a caterpillar and lays the eggs inside the caterpillar's body, and just lets the caterpillar live while the developing wasp larvae consume it from the inside. How unspeakably cruel is that, and what does it say about the mind of God? And as a consequence of that, Darwin gradually liberated himself from the natural theology idea, and looked to try to explain the origin of species without trying to bring in those kinds of agencies that motivated natural theology. I don't know if this is filling in the history any better, but
By the way, that's
kind
a huge theological challenge, I think, on its own, right? That people still get completely heated over, which is why in the world does God make the world such a nightmare sometimes, right? I think that's, aside from the natural theology world, that's a huge problem in all religious study. I think it's actually probably what a lot of kids probably go and ask their parents when they're 8 years old or something, when they're being dragged to church or something. It's a very
yeah.
difficult situation to face in general. So Darwin was like, well, maybe God's fine, but he's subject to some sort of natural process. It's like he can only work with this system, and so let's look at the system that God's dealing with without God being involved in it. Something like that.
Yeah, that's very much it. And I think it's kind of important to bring in that bring in this whole notion of purposefulness or intelligence, if you will, in the way life works. Not only the way life works, but also the way life evolves. And of course, this is the claim that intelligent design people make. It has some validity to it, in that they're saying that there's actually this idea of trying to divorce God from evolution altogether is wrong-headed. That actually there is intelligence at work, but where they tend to go is towards the ideal of the Platonic God. That God is out there shaping evolution in certain ways. And you don't have to draw that from any kind of inference. If you read the writings of people like Steve Meyer, they are completely honest about what their motivation is. As Steve Meyer says that this is motivated by my Christian faith, and okay, you can agree or disagree with that, but he's honest about that, about his motivations.
I love the
But
idea that the explanation that they have is just that God really hates caterpillars.
they might very well do that. They
Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. If you are listening to this podcast and you are enjoying yourself and you wonder how you can contribute to making sure that we can keep making this kind of incredible content, think no more and just come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci. For just 75 cents a week, you can help us keep this ship going for good.
they cast their arguments in more scientific ways. So for example, they're big on looking at the improbability of life, and certainly they are correct on that. They're not the only ones who are saying that. And even Richard Dawkins has mentioned this. He has a very interesting book called Climbing Mount Improbable, and so it reflects this idea that life is really kind of an improbable phenomenon. You wouldn't expect it to come from simple types of interactions of molecules with one another. This kind of atomist idea that derives from Democritus back in the Socratic days. But there's an entire middle ground in there that actually is mostly unoccupied right now, at least in the public mind. Is that if you just observe life itself, all right, if you observe how it works, how it adapts, it's very, very hard to escape the conclusion that there's some intelligence at work there, right? And that there's some ingeniousness and some ingenuity, I guess is the better word, and some creativity that distinguishes life from non-life. And
Well,
you
it's
know,
really it's very interesting because I feel like that is on the surface apparent, that there is a distinction between life and non-life, that there is this constant sea of choices that life is making that presumably is aiming it towards one outcome versus another.
yeah,
And yet you also have a really difficult feature of, I guess, the history of thought to wrestle with, which is that you mentioned Lyell. And Lyell was actually, in some ways, an enormous impediment to a full understanding of geology because he was an anti catastrophist to the extreme, right? Because he comes out of a time where the Bible is the background belief about how the world came to be. Bible is full of catastrophes, of floods, of fire and brimstone, all of these things. He comes around and he says, no, 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 no. Gradualism, everything is shaped by forces that we see around us. And that holds for a really long time until we finally get to the point that geologists are walking around and they're like, there's literally no way for this to have been formed by gradualism. Something
mhm.
catastrophic had to happen, and then the pendulum kind of swings back. And so with evolution, it seems like it's a very similar thing where Darwin is caught in this web where on one hand he's pushing against creationist thinking. He's pushing against biblical thinking. And yet he's ensnared in a trap of his own making, which is that if you cannot differentiate which of those pieces you should be pushing against, you're stuck perhaps eviscerating your own theory by throwing away things that should be included in it.
Give me an example.
Well, I think that this conversation that we're having about agency and will is kind of at the center of it, right? Because
So basically, they're trying to push out this superstitious idea that there's a guy with a beard and this guy who's like pulling levers and making all this stuff happen. But they inadvertently throw out the possibility that the creatures themselves have desires that they express and over time result in their morphology or their behaviors or what have you.
yeah, like, okay, so I think that what Darwinism does, and I I can just feel people screaming in the background as I say this. I think thank you. I think it throws away the possibility of there being anything that even approximates a soul. And I don't mean that in the sense of there being this, amount of spiritual substance that you can weigh as it leaves the body or some kind of mythical thing. I just mean it in the sense of there's an entity that contains within it some kind of set of desires and wants and imaginations for the future that are deeply informing all of the decisions that it's making in the present moment.
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at the history of Darwinian thought, it very much reflects that kind of thing that you're talking about, Anastasia. And Darwin and Wallace. I want to be sure to give full credit to Alfred Russel Wallace, who basically formulated the idea of natural selection completely independently of Darwin, and that Darwin-Wallace theory was actually a reaction to the a large part of it was motivated by reaction to the quasi-religious nature of natural theology, right? And so they sought a naturalistic explanation for the origin of species that did not have to invoke any kind of intervention by God or any kind of divine force. The subsequent history of Darwinian thought is quite interesting. Around the end of the
Can I just ask you a question before we move past this? I don't know if we'll get back
of
to it.
course.
Why do we call it Darwinism and not Wallaceanism or something? Why does Wallace get such a why does he get such a walk-on part? It's like if he actually came up with this whole thing by himself, why don't we hear about Wallace's travels around the world? And was Darwin just super good at glad-handing people, or why is his name stuck and Wallace's hasn't?
Wallaceanism is much harder to say than Darwinism, so that might have something to do with it.
Yeah. I mean, that's another fascinating thing about the whole history of evolutionary thought. And actually, there's a large group of people that actually take umbrage, quite substantial umbrage, and to an extent justifiably so, to call it Darwinism. So there's this body of Wallace fans out there that are always saying that no, you can't do this. The epithet that's been assigned to Wallace is Darwin's moon. This minor body orbiting out there that's been eclipsed by the Darwinian sun. All those kinds of things, and they deserve equal credit in part because Darwin had the idea. He had the idea, but he didn't really have much evidence for it. But Wallace had a lot of the evidence, and so they both came up with this idea of natural selection, but none of it could go forward without both the proposition and the evidence, and together they made a convincing case.
It's a pretty crazy story too. Like, if I understand it, Darwin was sitting on his own work for a very long time and was kind of not looking forward to the firestorm, the dumpster fire that would result from him publishing his ideas. And he got wind that Wallace had from his inner circle somehow that Wallace was doing the same thing. And I think that I think he reached out to Wallace, or Wallace reached out to, in any case, they basically agreed to publish a short version of this together at first, which is actually like kind of a heartwarming, beautiful situation if you consider the way that science works today, where people are like, I haven't published this, so I can't even talk about it. It's like, it's a very, very different competitive sphere than two guys who are like, hey man, I had that idea too. Let's write a paper. And he's like, yeah, sure. It's almost hard to imagine today.
Yeah, I mean Wallace, who was out there in the Malay Archipelago, on the other side of the world, basically, rowing around from island to island and these kinds of things. He was thinking about this, and he actually wrote to Charles Darwin, looking for his thoughts on his opinion. And as you say, Darwin himself had been sitting on this idea for nearly 25 years, trying to build the big magnum opus, and he figured that I've been scooped by Wallace. That's it for me. All my life's work is done. And all of his friends, who were Huxley and Lyell and others, thought that no, we know what Darwin has been doing. Somehow he hasn't really been scooped. This is different, and so they actually organized this compromise, if you will, of presenting this joint paper. And actually, Wallace probably.
So that was his friends. That was Darwin's friends who made it happen.
That was Darwin's friend. They were high up in the scientific establishment in Victorian England then, and of course Wallace was a kind of working class guy, And I think that they actually behaved kind of honorably towards Wallace, that the temptation of the upper crust of England was to say, he's not one of us, and therefore we don't really need to pay attention to him, and so I thought there was a lot of
we'll acknowledge him, but his name's not ending up in the theory.
Well, I know, and
Like, yeah, he did it too, but we're still gonna call it after the guy with the noble blood. Let's be very
well,
clear.
that's true. Yeah, yeah, that's true. Talk about sociology
He
of
doesn't even have
science
a
and practice.
PhD. My God, let alone a lordship.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
So, just the history of evolutionary thought is just filled with fascinating examples like this, which I wish we taught students today. But
yeah,
I
so much
was,
could be learned just by understanding the way that theories come to be prominent. It's really wild. I
yes,
think that will change, and I hope it does in the future, because
yeah,
you can
yeah,
learn so much just by seeing how people's minds wrestled with the landscape around them at
yeah,
the time.
yeah. But you were mentioning, Anastasia, that the whole Darwinian idea seems to be troubled by this concept of agency. That this is somehow kind of a dirty word to be talking about. You can't bring in things like wants and desires and things like this. And um, this is also part of the fascinating history of Darwinism, because by the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, Darwinism was basically kind of a dead letter. Nobody believed it. They thought, for example, that there were kinds of broad forces that shaped evolution and natural selection. It might work at the margins, but wasn't really going to be important. Evolutionary developmental biology, for example, the origin of form was thought, Darwinism doesn't really explain it very well. And the culmination of that was actually the discovery of the gene that began in the 19th century. And of course, Thomas Hunt Morgan, who every student in biology who's had to do fruit fly experiments knows about this. Morgan uh, uh, posited an entirely different and emphatically anti-Darwinian theory of evolution that
Hmm.
he called mutationism, and it was hard to argue with that. Morgan showed that mutations exist. We knew how mutations would be promulgated from generation to generation. Morgan was a brilliant scientist, knew a lot about the mechanics of this, and his argument was that forget natural selection. This doesn't work. What drives evolution is actually mutations of genes. That genes determine form and function, and therefore any kind of natural selection is not going to be a significant driver compared to the origin of mutations among genes. And
That's a little bit perplexing to me that he could even make that case, because the way that I understand the frame of natural selection would be that yes, there are mutations that arise, but then the competition between the fitness that is downstream of those mutations is what decides what gets fixed in the population.
yeah, that innovation you're talking about right there came after Morgan.
Huh.
There was it originated with a geneticist named Ronald Fisher, who was active in the well, he worked at one of the most prominent agricultural research stations in England, and he was a population geneticist, steeped in the genetics of populations, and his innovation, which given the stakes involved, I think was as significant an intellectual achievement compared to the theory of relativity among the physicists. His innovation was to bring in the notion of fitness as measured by propagation of genes in populations, and that basically rescued the Darwinian idea from Morganist mutationism. But along with it, there came kind of a radical shift in the way we think about Darwinian natural selection. The title of Darwin's Origin of Species was focused on favored races, as species, living things. After Fisher and his genetical theory of natural selection, it became selection of favored genes, right? And so you still have an element of selection going on there, but now it's focused on genes rather than on organisms. And this is really a radical departure because, among other things, it reduces the role of any kind of agency, living agency, if you will, from the process of evolution. And that
Which
was a
is
watershed.
hilarious because Dawkins comes along much later and he's like, no, the genes are striving.
Well,
Hold on.
He's speaking
Oh,
metaphorically.
he's like, no, I don't really mean that. I don't mean it. But I kind of mean it, but don't hold me to it.
Hold on. Let's not. I
Sorry,
want to
I'm
get
way
to
out of
Dawkins,
order.
but that we're just like there's a piece here that is missing for me because you're like Darwin writes, publishes his theory, and then it totally falls out of favor. And then it is after Morgan proposes this genetic theory of mutationism that somebody comes and rescues it, and that gap where it becomes published and unpopular is completely mysterious
How
to
long
me.
is that, by the way? Are we talking
Yeah.
like 100 years or?
Uh, there's a historian, Peter Bowler, who's written some very interesting books about this. Among them, he calls this the Eclipse of Darwinism. And Darwinism began to kind of fall out of favor in the 1880s. And with the discovery of Mendel's work in 1900s, that started to kind of cut the props out from Darwinism. And Morgan was working in the 1920s, right? So that's the time frame that we're looking at. And
Wait, I'm sorry. How they discovered Mendel? Mendel was like a monk from medieval times or something?
I don't think so. I
No.
think
no, no.
Mendel was.
No. All right. Sorry. Yeah, I obviously didn't do that great in high school biology.
Oh,
Sorry, guys.
he's
Be-
like mid 1800s, right?
yeah, he was
Okay.
a
Okay.
contemporary of Charles Darwin. Yeah.
Man alive. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's why the
Uh,
experts here.
this goes to your point that they don't teach this in school, you know?
No, they don't. I mean,
I know.
I always had a picture of Mendel wearing one of those monk outfits from like Robin Hood Men in Tights or what.
To be fair, like Mendel's story is crazy because we actually wrote this. We're almost done with our book about the lots of things. I guess material physics.
Science.
Um, and we wrote this into the book, and I was astounded because I was researching Mendel's background, and his family had literally lived in the same house in somewhere in like present day Czechoslovakia, like near Brno, for
That's right.
more than 300 years.
Yeah.
And then he got to a point where he basically was like, well, I have to either become a farmer on this like plot of dirt land, and there was a war. I think that they were displaced by some like Austro-Hungarian conflict, and he realized that his only path towards actually being able to study stuff was to go into the priesthood. But he went into the priesthood again in a town of like 100 people, and so I think that the reason that you think of him as being this medieval monk is because it's hard to believe that it was a particularly cosmopolitan or modern place where he went. I think that he did very much go back in time, and so when you see pictures of him, it seemed or drawings. Let's be honest.
So wait, he's the Punnett Square guy and stuff.
No,
I
no,
just remember this.
no, that's an actual guy named Punnett.
Oh no! All right.
No,
God, this is making me sweat. I'm actually remembering. What was her name? Oh yeah, I'm trying to think. My high school biology teacher's name would be cringing right now.
But he was a monk. You're absolutely right. Pictures of him have him in the black robes with a crucifix on his chest and all that. But
why did this go against Darwin though? That's confusing to me. It seems like it would fit right in.
Well, if you think about what a gene does, right? It's an agent against change, right? If you have a gene for something in one generation, if you pass that gene on to the next generation, it's going to do the same thing. So it's actually an agent against change, whereas Darwin was proposing a theory for change, right? And so that's the fundamental conflict between the Mendelian gene idea and Darwinism. And so that was one of the issues that the people at the beginning of the 20th century were dealing with. And of course, Mendel's work was obscure. He did publish in his local natural history journal, which and there's some dispute about whether Darwin actually knew about Mendel. In any event, it didn't inform any of his thinking. But
Well, Mendel
Hi-
also famously massaged his numbers, and so
oh,
even if he had seen some kind of odd mutations arising or some kind of
yeah,
unexpected characteristics in the next generation, he painted a much simpler picture of a
yeah,
very straightforward conservation of genetic.
yeah.
Well, he didn't even have genetic. It was like a conservation of heredity was the picture that he painted.
Yeah, that's right. And we have Ronald Fisher actually to thank for this idea that Mendel may have fudged his numbers, and of course, you can see the motivations there. Fisher was very motivated by trying to reconcile Mendelian genetics, which again I'll say was an argument against change, except as mutation would bring about change, and what Fisher believed in his heart was true about Darwinism, and that was the reconciliation. And as I say, that reconciliation was I think one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the early 20th century. Easily on a par with the relativity thing that was happening in physics at the time. I mean, you had these two diametrically opposed philosophies of evolutionary change, and Ronald Fisher reconciled them.
Well, with relativity, it's crazy because what it is it's basically Einstein going back and saying, hold on a second, I think that these two separate things are actually the same thing.
Hmm.
And so it feels like maybe this is just an era where people are capable of going through and saying, okay, well, there's all these ideas floating around and they're all pointing at some feature of nature. Like, can we combine them in some way that reveals something deeper?
Is this turning into an automated materialist perspective by the time the genes and the mutations and the heredity
Hmm.
and what's left of Darwinism have been rolled into one burrito at this point? Is this very much devoid of the need for striving, or is that still present in people's exegeses?
Well, because it's almost impossible to imagine a mutational theory of the world the way that Morgan is constructing it, where it's like mutations are the only agents of change, having anything to do with the organism's desires or any kind of felt sense, right?
Yeah, that's been an ongoing program, if you will, in evolutionary thought. Um, it's almost as if the entire corpus of evolutionary thought, modern evolutionary thought, let me just say scientific evolutionary thought in quotes, is dedicated to the abolition of purpose from our thinking about biology and about life and also its history as well. There's this presumption that it can only be scientific if you don't admit kind of spooky ideas like striving. What is that? What's intentionality? If you look at living things and they seem to be pretty well designed, pretty well built for what they're doing out there in the world, that it's not real design, it's only apparent design, and we can explain it away that way because what's really driving things is this kind of churning of molecules of DNA. Could be very complex, could be very ordered, all these kinds of things, but there's no purpose or intelligence or striving at the heart of any of it. If you see that, then you're somehow deluded. You're under the grip of an illusion, and that's that's a big part of what modern evolutionary thought is. You don't have to bring in purpose and intelligence and striving. But that to me is less convincing with every year.
It's really interesting. Whenever that word "apparent," by the way, I didn't really encounter that word till I went to do my PhD, but I found it everywhere after I started working in some really esoteric subdomain. And it's a funny, funny thing because, what does it really mean when you see apparent as a adjective in front of some measured variable? It means that your measured variable hasn't doesn't actually tell you the reality of the situation. And people just kind of move on like, it's no big deal.
Yeah.
That seems to point to the fact that measuring something like striving, purpose, or intentionality is really, really difficult. And therefore, rolling it into some definition that can be applied to living systems and evaluate the differences or track its evolution over time, for lack of a better word, is going to prove really, really difficult. But it might be worth a shot. I did take a second, by the way, just now to check out Darwin's Origin of Species, and I found that he uses the word striving 7 times, and it's all with respect to the intentionality of a group of organisms to move towards some future. So they want, they want growth, or they want to multiply geometrically or something like that. It's always talking about the will of this group of creatures, which is really funny that it's been so wholly removed from the label Darwinism at this point.
Yeah, and that's credit to Darwin as a naturalist. He was keenly aware of these kinds of things. He even promulgated some quite interesting theories about how adaptation, and Darwin was very closely motivated by adaptation. How adaptation could be heritable. He knew that natural selection could not work if there wasn't some heritability of adaptation. And of course, at the time, no one really knew what heredity was or any things like this. And he came up with a theory for heritable evolution called Pangenesis, which was, very close to the Lamarckian idea, which he thought, was wrong himself. He looked at Darwinism as an alternative to the Lamarckian idea that lineages strived towards something, and he
I didn't
he ended
realize
up
that
getting.
Lamarck believed that lineages strived as much as he believed that lineages were informed by the environment and direct actions of their parents. Like the example that I distinctly remember from, high school biology textbooks is
Mhm.
the crab with the one big claw, and it's like the reason that the crab ends up with the big claw is because it uses that claw a lot and then passes that off to its children. And the reason that
Like strengthens it or something to work its hand out all the time.
yeah, and it's like the reason that the blacksmith's sons are big is because the father used the muscles, and so that gets transmitted to the children.
Who was this guy, by the way? Where was he?
Lamarck.
When?
Lamarck.
Yeah. Who was he?
Who was he? I actually have no idea.
He was a
like, I don't know. I'm like,
Stay
I
after
don't know.
class, Mendeberry.
He's the guy.
Yeah. He was a French naturalist who was active at the end of the 18th century. He lived through the French Revolution. He ended up being the curator of the what was called then the Garden of Plants. It was called before the Revolution the Royal Garden, and it became the Garden of Plants. Because of the ideology of the French Revolution.
That seems redundant.
Well, yeah, I know, but that was the climate in which he was working. And Lamarck's idea, it's often portrayed as the inheritance of acquired characters. I don't like that, because what is mutation other than an inheritance of an acquired character, right? And his idea was that there were two forces that drove life. One was something he called the complexifying force, which is the tendency of life to become ever more complex. And the other was called an adaptive force, which is the kinds of things that you were talking about with the blacksmith, arms getting stronger than non-blacksmiths or what have you. And what Lamarck said was that, okay, that's all very nice when we talk about an organism. So, for example, the complexifying force is evident when you have the development of, say, a chicken from an egg. You start with this very simple thing, and this complexifying force turns it into a living chicken. And then the adaptive force was the blacksmith arm getting stronger. And what Lamarck said, his real innovation was to say that those very things actually apply to lineages of organisms as well as organisms themselves, right? So there was no difference between the forces that drove organisms themselves from the evolution of lineages of organisms, and this was a radical departure from the kind of idealistic philosophy of people like Linnaeus, for example.
And so Darwin's interpretation of this was that he agreed or he disagreed, because it seems like if you take
Isn't Darwin before this? Sorry,
no
Darwin's after
Darwin's
this.
after, yeah. So that part I
Man.
do know.
Yeah,
Gosh,
They're gonna
haven't
come for
sat
our
this test ever
PhDs,
again.
man.
Yeah.
So I just it seems like this is like proto-Darwinian thinking already.
It is. Yeah.
And Darwin is always cast in opposition to Lamarck when you look at things, where it's like, oh, Lamarck had these dumb ideas, and then Darwin came along and he solved everything for the rest of time. But it seems like it's kind of a natural extension to say that, okay, so if organisms do complexify and if organisms do adapt, is there some version of this that we can tell on a wider scale than just the blacksmith getting swole?
Yeah. And Darwin was motivated by trying to get away from the sort of idealistic, almost vitalist thinking that permeated Lamarck's idea. The complexifying force. What is that? It has a vitalist odor about it. And Darwin wanted to get away from that. But yet, of course, when Darwin had to come up with a theory for heritability of adaptation, his theory was very Lamarckian in character. And, I don't know if we want to get into the details of Darwin's Pangenesis theory, but, he had the idea that every tissue in the body would send out these little bodies called gemmules, and the number of gemmules that a tissue would send out would depend upon how strongly that tissue was used. And so you had muscle gemmules of a blacksmith, muscles of a blacksmith, they would send out more muscle gemmules, and those would come to reside in the ova or the sperm, and that would be the transmission of heritability. The heritability of adaptation in the organism to lineage. And that was running at the time against the kind of rising understanding of genetics that culminated in Mendelian genetics. And Darwin got beat up badly by his colleagues over his pangenesis theory, and he eventually ended up abandoning it. But I think that's testimony to Darwin's deep immersion in the nature of life, that he saw things like striving, he saw things like intentionality, he saw things like you really need to transmit adaptation across lineages. That's the only way you can make his theory work. And the problem with mutationism, in my view, is that it really narrowed that scope of natural history from our understanding of how life worked. It basically rendered ideas that actually motivated Darwin because of his deep immersion in the nature of life. We're sort of pushing that out of our thinking and evolutionary thought, and this is, as I said, I've described this as a program of the abolition of purpose. You can't understand life scientifically. This is not me saying this. This is the program saying this, that you cannot understand life properly if you're going to bring in, spooky ideas like purposefulness and striving and things like that. That's non-scientific and therefore has no place in our thinking. But I think that's missing a really important point of what life is. How can you be a biologist if you're not going to be incorporating some of the fundamental things about life itself, which is purposefulness, striving, intentionality, those kinds of things.
And people do tend to do what their parents did, at least historically, like that. There is something to that. I also think there seems to be something to the, what is it called, pangenesis idea of these little like that kind of points a little bit towards hormones and epigenetic modification to me.
Yeah.
And
Exosomes.
Yeah, there's all these little pieces of the puzzle that modern molecular biology is starting to unravel, but it seems like Darwin's intuitions about that may have been off in the finer points, but there are pieces of both of these ideas that seem to persist into reality. I think this is, by the way, with regard to the blacksmith, and your dad was a blacksmith, so you know, uh,
Mhm.
I think that this is one of the reasons people are always saying humans aren't a good model organism for evolution, because they don't want to have to consider how these behavioral modifications are inherited in a mimetic sense necessarily with respect to the biological community at large. It's like, oh, well, if humans are the only ones that are doing this weird mimetic stuff, we can just exceptionalize them, cut them off, put them on a plate somewhere else, and then go back to our very, material centric story of genes and mutations and whatever for
I
the
think
rest of
that
biology.
it's just so hard. Yeah, for the rest of biology. Sorry, I cut you off.
You gotta go.
I think that it's so hard to look at the rest of biology and to be able to evaluate what it even means for there to be some kind of cultural lineage, because we haven't
Mhm.
even acknowledged that there could be culture. And
Yeah.
so, how do you attempt to explain evolution on the basis of culture if there's no such
I was
thing?
just thinking how funny it is that we call bacterial cultures. Like, I'm gonna culture this bacteria.
Yeah,
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 absolutely.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
I think that the question of, how do we do biology without including purpose and striving if we're trying to understand like what this is going to be what the back half of this conversation is about. But what I really want to get to is I want to get through this arc of how we go from Darwin to mutationism to the gene as the unit of natural selection, and we've completely removed this, elan vital, I think is what it was called for a long time, this kind of
Mhm,
spirit
mhm,
that animates life,
mhm,
to Richard Dawkins, who's like, well, actually, it's the selfish gene, and the selfish
mhm.
gene is motivating all these things. But it turns out that it's not true motivation, it's abstraction. Like, this is still,
It's just an analogy.
it's just an analogy. But
That's all for the first part of our conversation with Scott Turner. Next time, we are going to dig into the specific future of evolutionary biology and what it would take to overcome the problems that we have seen emerge over the course of the history of this discipline today. So look forward for that episode in the coming weeks. See you then.